Picture this: a team of archaeologists working in the scorching heat of the Israeli desert suddenly stops digging. Their brushes freeze mid-stroke. Before them lies a stone tablet covered in ancient script that hasn't been seen by human eyes for over 2,000 years. As they carefully translate the weathered characters, their faces turn pale. The inscription mentions a name they never expected to find outside the pages of the Bible: Pontius Pilate. This isn't fiction. This actually happened in 1961, and it's just one of 15 shocking archaeological discoveries that have sent shockwaves through the scientific community, forcing even the most skeptical scholars to reconsider what they thought they knew about biblical history. For centuries, critics dismissed many biblical accounts as myth, legend, or religious propaganda. But what happens when the earth itself begins to speak? What happens when ancient stones start telling stories that perfectly align with scriptures written thousands of years ago? Today, we're going to journey through 15 of the most mind-blowing archaeological finds that have turned skepticism into stunned silence and transformed our understanding of biblical truth. Some of these discoveries were hidden for millennia, others were found by accident, and a few were discovered in places so unexpected that even the archaeologists who found them could barely believe their eyes. Each one tells a story that reaches across thousands of years to confirm details that scholars once thought were impossible to verify. Are you ready to see how the ancient world is rewriting everything we thought we knew about the Bible? The relationship between archaeology and biblical studies has always been complicated. On one side, you have believers who see every verse as literal truth. On the other, skeptics who view ancient religious texts as collections of myths and moral teachings with little historical basis. But somewhere in the middle, a fascinating conversation has been unfolding for over a century. Archaeological evidence doesn't prove or disprove faith itself, but it can shed remarkable light on the historical context in which biblical events supposedly took place. When archaeologists uncover physical evidence that corroborates specific biblical claims about people, places, and events, it doesn't necessarily validate the spiritual messages of Scripture. But it does something equally powerful. It demonstrates that these ancient texts contain kernels of historical truth that survived thousands of years of transmission. The 15 discoveries we're about to explore span different time periods, geographical locations, and types of evidence. Some confirm the existence of biblical figures who were once thought to be legendary. Others validate specific events that critics claimed never happened. A few reveal details about ancient cultures that perfectly match biblical descriptions. And several provide context that makes biblical narratives more historically plausible than anyone imagined. What makes these findings particularly intriguing is that they weren't discovered by religious institutions trying to prove a point. Most were uncovered by secular archaeological teams following standard scientific methods. Many surprised even the archaeologists who found them. Some sat in museums for decades before anyone realized their biblical significance. As we examine each discovery, we'll explore not just what was found, but how it was found, who found it, and why it matters. We'll look at the evidence with the same critical eye that archaeologists use, acknowledging both the strengths and limitations of each find, because the most compelling discoveries are those that can withstand rigorous scrutiny. Discovery 1: the Pilate Stone, physical proof of the man who condemned Jesus. Our journey begins in 1961 at Caesarea Maritima, an ancient Roman city on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. Italian archaeologists were excavating the ruins of a Roman theater when they made a discovery that would electrify the archaeological world. Embedded in a staircase, clearly reused as building material, was a limestone inscription that would become known as the Pilate Stone. The inscription was written in Latin, and as the archaeologists carefully cleaned away centuries of dirt and debris, three crucial lines emerged. The first line was partially damaged, but the second line clearly read Pontius Pilatus. The third line identified him as Praefectus Judaeae, prefect of Judea. This was monumental. For the first time in history, archaeologists had found physical evidence confirming the existence of Pontius Pilate outside of biblical and other ancient literary sources. But even more significant was what the inscription revealed about Pilate's official title. The Gospel accounts refer to Pilate as a governor, and later Roman historians called him a procurator. But the stone uses the term praefectus, which means prefect. This might seem like a minor detail, but it's actually crucial for understanding the historical accuracy of the New Testament accounts. Modern historians had long debated Pilate's exact title and the nature of his authority in Judea. The discovery of the Pilate stone revealed that during the time when Jesus would have been crucified, Pilate indeed held the title of prefect, with the specific authority that this position entailed. The title procurator came later, as Roman administrative structures evolved. The stone also mentions that Pilate dedicated a building called the Tiberium to Emperor Tiberius, which aligns perfectly with what we know about Roman imperial cult practices and the timeline of Tiberius's reign, which coincides with Jesus's ministry according to the Gospel accounts. But here's what makes this discovery even more fascinating. The stone wasn't found in some prominent location where you'd expect to find official inscriptions. It was discovered reused as building material, casually incorporated into a staircase. This suggests that after Pilate's time, his monuments were dismantled and repurposed, which aligns with historical accounts of his eventual downfall and recall to Rome. The casual reuse of the stone also speaks to its authenticity. If someone were creating a forgery to support biblical claims, they wouldn't have embedded it in a staircase where it could easily be overlooked. The inscription bears all the hallmarks of genuine Roman administrative documentation from the 1st century. The Pilate stone is now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but a replica stands at Caesarea Maritima, where it was found. When you see it in person, you're looking at stone that was carved while Pontius Pilate was still in power, while Jesus was walking the roads of Galilee and Judea. For skeptics who had long argued that Pilate might be a fictional character invented by early Christians, the stone provided undeniable proof that he was indeed a real historical figure who held exactly the position described in the Gospel accounts. The stone doesn't prove that Pilate condemned Jesus to crucifixion, but it confirms that there was indeed a Roman prefect named Pontius Pilate in Judea during the exact time period when the Gospels claim Jesus was tried and executed. This discovery opened the floodgates for a new appreciation of the historical reliability of New Testament accounts. If the Gospels were accurate about details like Pilate's existence and position, what else might they have gotten right? Discovery 2. The House of David inscription, proof that King David was real. For decades, biblical minimalists argued that King David was likely a mythological figure, possibly based on a minor tribal leader, but greatly exaggerated by later biblical writers, seeking to create a glorious past for their people. The united monarchy of David and Solomon, they claimed, was largely fictional, a kind of ancient propaganda designed to legitimize later political claims. Then came July 1993, and everything changed. Archaeologist Avraham Biron was excavating at Tel Dan, an ancient city in northern Israel. when his team uncovered fragments of a dark basalt stone inscription. The fragments were found in a secondary use, incorporated into a later wall, but the inscription itself was much older, dating to the 9th century BCE. As epigraphers worked to piece together and translate the Aramaic text, they realized they were looking at something extraordinary. The inscription appeared to be a victory stela, erected by an Aramaean king boasting about his military conquests against Israel and Judah. But buried within this ancient bragging was a phrase that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. House of David. The inscription describes how the Aramaean king defeated the king of Israel and the king of the House of David. This was the first time archaeologists had found the name David mentioned outside the Bible in a contemporary ancient inscription. The significance cannot be overstated. Here was physical evidence from the 9th century BCE, written by enemies of Israel, that acknowledged David as the founder of a royal dynasty. The enemies of Israel wouldn't have invented David or his dynasty. They would have had every reason to minimize or ignore Israel's royal claims if they weren't real. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who was this Aramean king who erected the stele? Based on historical context and the details mentioned in the inscription, most scholars believe it was Hazael of Damascus, a king mentioned in both the Bible and Assyrian records from the same period. The inscription describes military campaigns that align with biblical accounts of conflicts between Aram Damascus and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah during the reigns of Joram and Ahaziah. According to 2 Kings, both of these kings died during conflicts with Hazael, exactly what the inscription seems to be claiming credit for. What makes this even more remarkable is that the inscription was found in Dan, a city that biblical accounts describe as being on the northern frontier between Israel and Aram. The stele was discovered in what appears to have been a gate area, exactly where you'd expect to find a victory monument erected by a conquering army. The discovery of additional fragments over the following years provided more context. The complete inscription reveals a level of detail about 9th century political relationships that perfectly matches the biblical accounts of the same period. It mentions specific kings and kingdoms in ways that demonstrate intimate knowledge of the political landscape of ancient Israel and its neighbors. Critics initially questioned the reading of House of David, suggesting alternative interpretations of the ancient script. But as more scholars examined the inscription, the consensus solidified. The phrase by TWD in ancient Aramaic script clearly reads as House of David, using the standard ancient Near Eastern way of referring to a royal dynasty by its founder's name. This discovery fundamentally changed the academic debate about the historical David. While scholars still debate the extent of David's kingdom and the accuracy of specific biblical details about his reign, the Tel Dan inscription proved that David was indeed a real historical figure, significant enough that his dynasty was known to Israel's enemies a century after his death. The inscription also provides crucial evidence for the existence of the Kingdom of Judah as a distinct political entity in the 9th century BCE, corroborating biblical accounts of the divided monarchy period. Perhaps most importantly, the discovery demonstrated that biblical texts preserve historically accurate information about political realities in ancient Israel, even in accounts written centuries after the events they describe. The House of David inscription showed that biblical writers had access to reliable historical traditions about Israel's monarchic period. Today, the Tel Dan inscription is housed in the Israel Museum, where visitors can see the actual stone that first whispered David's name across nearly 3 millennia of silence. Discovery 3. The Hezekiah's Tunnel Inscription. Engineering marvel confirms biblical account. Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries hide in plain sight for centuries before anyone realizes their significance. Such is the case with one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in biblical history: Hezekiah's Tunnel in Jerusalem. The tunnel itself was never lost. For over 2,000 years, people knew about the underground water channel that brings water from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam in the city of David. But it wasn't until 1880 that anyone discovered the ancient inscription that transforms this engineering marvel into a stunning confirmation of biblical accuracy. The story begins with a group of boys playing in the tunnel. One of them noticed strange markings on the tunnel wall, scratched into the rock in ancient Hebrew script. When archaeologists examined the inscription, they realized they were looking at one of the most detailed ancient engineering records ever discovered. But first, let's understand why this tunnel matters biblically. According to 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings, when King Hezekiah learned that the Assyrian army under Sennacherib was approaching Jerusalem in 701 BCE, he took an extraordinary step to protect the city. He ordered the construction of a tunnel to bring water from the Gihon Spring, which was outside the city walls, to a pool inside the fortified area. The biblical account is remarkably specific. It was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon Spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city of David. The purpose was clear: deny water to the besieging army while ensuring Jerusalem's water supply. When archaeologists measured the tunnel, they discovered something astounding. The tunnel stretches for 1,750 feet through solid rock, following a winding S-shaped course. But here's what makes it truly remarkable. It was dug by two teams working toward each other from opposite ends, meeting in the middle with perfect precision. The inscription found on the tunnel wall tells the story of this engineering feat in the words of the ancient workers themselves. It describes how the tunnel was excavated by two teams of miners working toward each other, using only iron tools and oil lamps. The inscription captures the dramatic moment when the two teams finally broke through to meet each other. The tunneling was completed, while the miners were still lifting their picks toward each other, and while there were still 3 cubits to go. The voice of each man calling to his fellow could be heard, because there was a crack in the rock running from south to north. On the day the tunnel was broken through, the miners struck pick against pick, man against man. Then the water flowed from the spring to the pool, 1,200 cubits long. The precision required for this achievement is staggering. Using only ancient surveying techniques, two teams managed to dig through solid limestone, following a serpentine route that avoided important structures above ground, and meet with an accuracy that would be impressive even by modern standards. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the tunnel confirms that it was indeed constructed in the late 8th century BCE, exactly when the biblical accounts claim Hezekiah built it. The inscription itself has been dated to the same period based on its Hebrew script characteristics. But the tunnel reveals something even more significant about the historical accuracy of biblical accounts. The construction of such a massive public works project would have required enormous resources, sophisticated planning, and a level of political organization that confirms Jerusalem was indeed the capital of a significant kingdom during Hezekiah's reign. The tunnel also provides evidence for the historical reality of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. Ancient sources including Assyrian records and biblical accounts, describe how Sennacherib's army surrounded Jerusalem, but mysteriously withdrew without capturing the city. The existence of Hezekiah's tunnel shows that Jerusalem's leaders took the Assyrian threat seriously enough to undertake one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence from around Jerusalem confirms that the city expanded dramatically during Hezekiah's reign, as refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel fled south to escape Assyrian conquest. This population growth would have made securing Jerusalem's water supply even more critical. The tunnel wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a desperate gambit by a king facing the most powerful military machine of his era. That this gambit succeeded is confirmed not only by biblical accounts, but by Assyrian records, which boast about Sennacherib's conquests throughout the region, but conspicuously avoid claiming victory over Jerusalem itself. Modern visitors can still walk through Hezekiah's tunnel, wading through knee-deep water along the same route carved by ancient miners. The inscription has been removed for preservation and is now displayed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, but a replica marks the spot where it was discovered. When you walk through that tunnel today, you're following in the footsteps of ancient Jerusalem's residents who fled through its passages during the Assyrian siege, carrying with them the hope that their city's walls and their God's protection would prove stronger than the world's greatest empire. Discovery 4. The Caiaphas Ossuary, the high priest who tried Jesus. In November 1990, construction workers building a water park in the Peace Forest south of Jerusalem accidentally broke through the roof of an ancient burial cave. What they had discovered would turn out to be one of the most significant New Testament archaeological finds of the 20th century. When archaeologists arrived to investigate, they found an intact first-century Jewish family tomb containing 12 limestone ossuaries, bone boxes used for secondary burial in ancient Jewish practice. Most of the ossuaries contained typical inscriptions with common Jewish names of the period. But one ornately decorated ossuary bore an inscription that made archaeologists stop in their tracks. Carved into the limestone in Aramaic script were the words Yehoseph bar Caiapha, Joseph son of Caiaphas. This was the same Caiaphas mentioned in the Gospels as the high priest who presided over Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. The ossuary itself is remarkable. Unlike the plain bone boxes typically used by ordinary families, this ossuary is elaborately decorated with carved rosettes and palm motifs, indicating the wealth and high social status of the individual buried within. The craftsmanship and decoration are consistent with what archaeologists would expect for a high priest's family tomb. But the inscription raised questions. Why does it read Joseph, son of Caiaphas, rather than simply Caiaphas? The answer lies in understanding first-century Jewish naming practices. Caiaphas was likely either a family name or a nickname, while Joseph was the high priest's given name. The Jewish historian Josephus confirms this, referring to the high priest as Joseph, who was called Caiaphas. The dating of the tomb and its contents aligns perfectly with what we know about the historical Caiaphas. Archaeological evidence suggests the tomb was in use from the late 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE. Coins found in the tomb date to the reign of Herod Agrippa I, who ruled from 41 to 44 CE. According to both the Gospels and Josephus, Caiaphas served as high priest from approximately 18 to 36 CE, appointed by the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus and eventually removed from office by the Roman governor Vitellius. This timeline fits perfectly with the archaeological evidence from the tomb. The location of the tomb is also significant. It was discovered in the Akeldama area, traditionally associated with the burial ground purchased with Judas Iscariot's 30 pieces of silver. While there's no direct connection between the tomb and that biblical account, the location is consistent with where wealthy Jerusalem families of the 1st century would have built their burial caves. Inside the Caiaphas ossuary, archaeologists found the remains of 6 individuals: 2 infants, a child, a teenager, an adult woman, and an elderly man. The elderly man, approximately 60 years old, is believed to be Caiaphas himself. The presence of multiple generations in the same ossuary reflects the Jewish practice of family burial, where bones of deceased relatives were often placed together. The discovery provides remarkable physical evidence for the existence of one of the most controversial figures in Christian history. According to the Gospel accounts, Caiaphas played a central role in Jesus' arrest and trial, coordinating with Judas Iscariot and presiding over the Sanhedrin's condemnation of Jesus. The Gospel of John records Caiaphas making a prophetic statement during the deliberations about what to do with Jesus. "It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Whether one views this as cold political calculation or divine prophecy, the ossuary confirms that these words were spoken by a real historical figure who held exactly the position the Gospels claim. The ossuary also provides insight into the wealth and power of the high priestly families in 1st century Jerusalem. The elaborate decoration and prime burial location demonstrate the social and economic status that would have allowed Caiaphas to wield significant influence in both religious and political affairs. Critics have questioned whether the inscription definitely refers to the biblical Caiaphas, pointing out that both Joseph and Caiaphas were common names in 1st century Palestine. However, the combination of the specific inscription, the dating, the location, the elaborate nature of the ossuary, and the historical context makes the identification extremely probable. The discovery of the Caiaphas ossuary adds physical evidence to the Gospel accounts of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. It doesn't prove the theological claims about Jesus, but it confirms that the political and religious figures described in the Passion narratives were real people who lived in the right place at the right time with the appropriate authority to have played the roles attributed to them. Today, the Caiaphas ossuary is housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where visitors can see the actual limestone box that once held the bones of the man who, according to Christian belief, condemned the Son of God to death. Discovery 5. The Pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the blind man. For centuries, pilgrims visiting Jerusalem have been shown a small, ancient pool and told it was the biblical Pool of Siloam, where, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus healed a man born blind. But in 2004, a discovery during routine sewer repair work revealed that the real Pool of Siloam had been hiding just yards away, buried under centuries of debris and forgotten by history. The story began when city workers were fixing a sewage pipe near the original pool when they uncovered ancient stone steps. What they had stumbled upon would prove to be one of the most significant New Testament archaeological discoveries in decades. Archaeologist Eli Shukran was called to investigate, and what he found was extraordinary. The newly discovered pool was massive, much larger than the site previously identified as the Pool of Siloam. The pool measured approximately 225 feet long and was fed by the same Gihon spring that supplies Hezekiah's tunnel, which we discussed earlier. But this wasn't just any ancient pool. The construction, dating, and location all perfectly matched the Pool of Siloam described in the Gospel of John. The pool features a series of stone steps leading down into the water, exactly the kind of design you'd expect for a ritual purification pool or mikveh. In 1st century Jerusalem, carbon dating of organic materials and pottery found in the pool confirmed that it was indeed in active use during the 1st century CE, precisely when Jesus would have walked through Jerusalem. Coins found in the pool's debris layers date from the late 2nd Temple period, providing additional confirmation of the timeline. The discovery is significant, not just for its biblical connections, but for what it reveals about 1st century Jerusalem's infrastructure. The pool was clearly a major public facility, capable of accommodating large numbers of people. This aligns with historical descriptions of Jerusalem during the 2nd Temple period as a bustling pilgrimage destination that needed significant water resources. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus encountered a man who had been blind from birth near the pool. After making mud with his saliva and dirt, Jesus applied it to the man's eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man did as instructed and returned able to see. The newly discovered pool provides the physical setting for this miracle account. The stone steps would have allowed the blind man to safely navigate into the water, and the pool's size suggests it was a well-known, easily accessible location, exactly what you'd expect from the gospel narrative. But the pool's significance extends beyond this single miracle story. The pool of Siloam was connected to important Jewish religious observances. During the Feast of Tabernacles, priests would draw water from this pool in golden vessels and carry it to the temple for ceremonial purposes. This ritual, known as the water libation ceremony, was one of the most joyful celebrations in the Jewish calendar. The Gospel of John places Jesus in Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles and records him making dramatic statements about living water during this very celebration. Understanding the pool's role in the feast adds deeper meaning to Jesus' words and actions during this period. Archaeological evidence also confirms that the pool was destroyed during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The destruction layers found during excavation align with historical accounts of the systematic destruction of Jerusalem's infrastructure during the siege. The discovery challenges previous assumptions about the geography of 1st century Jerusalem. The pool's location, size, and construction demonstrate that the areas south of the Temple Mount were more developed and sophisticated than many scholars had assumed. Excavations have also revealed that the pool was part of a larger complex of ritual baths and water installations, suggesting that this area of Jerusalem was a major center for Jewish purification rituals. This context makes the gospel accounts even more plausible. If you were going to set a healing story involving washing and purification, the Pool of Siloam would be the perfect location. The pool also connects to the broader theme of water and purification that runs through the Gospel of John. From Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River to his conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, water imagery plays a crucial role in John's Gospel. The Pool of Siloam provides a tangible link to this theological theme. One of the most remarkable aspects of the discovery is how it remained hidden for so long. The pool was gradually buried by debris from Jerusalem's various destructions and rebuilding projects over the centuries. Only the accidental break in a sewer line revealed what had been there all along. Today, visitors to Jerusalem can see the excavated Pool of Siloam and walk down the same stone steps that the blind man would have used. The site is still being excavated, with new discoveries adding to our understanding of 1st century Jerusalem's water systems and religious practices. The Pool of Siloam discovery demonstrates how archaeological evidence can illuminate biblical narratives, providing historical context that makes ancient accounts more vivid and believable. It doesn't prove that miracles occurred, but it confirms that the settings described in the Gospels reflect accurate knowledge of 1st century Jerusalem's geography and infrastructure. Discovery 6. The Galilee Boat, a window into Jesus' maritime ministry. In 1986, Israel was experiencing one of its worst droughts in decades. The Sea of Galilee had receded to historically low levels, exposing parts of the lakebed that hadn't seen sunlight for centuries. For archaeologists, this environmental crisis created an unprecedented opportunity. Brothers Moshe and Yuval Lufin, members of a local kibbutz, were walking along the newly exposed shoreline near Magdala when they spotted something unusual protruding from the mud. What they had discovered would become known as the Galilee Boat, and it would provide an extraordinary window into life during the time of Jesus. The boat they found was ancient, really ancient. As archaeologists carefully excavated it from the mud that had preserved it for nearly 2 millennia, they realized they were looking at a fishing vessel from the 1st century CE, precisely the type of boat that Jesus and his disciples would have used during their ministry around the Sea of Galilee. The excavation was a race against time. As soon as the boat was exposed to air, the wood began to deteriorate rapidly after being preserved in the lake's anaerobic mud for 2,000 years. Archaeologists had to work around the clock, carefully documenting every detail before the structure collapsed. The boat measures about 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide, large enough to carry 13 to 15 people, which aligns perfectly with gospel accounts of Jesus traveling with his 12 disciples. The construction techniques, materials, and design all match what historians expected 1st century Galilean fishing boats to look like. Carbon-14 dating of the wood confirmed that the boat was built sometime between 100 BCE and 70 CE, placing it squarely within the period of Jesus' ministry. The boat was constructed primarily of cedar and oak planks, with mortise and tenon joints secured by iron nails, exactly the construction methods used by 1st century boat builders in the region. What makes this discovery particularly fascinating is what it reveals about the economy and technology of 1st century Galilee. The boat shows evidence of extensive repairs using different types of wood, suggesting it had a long working life. This speaks to the value placed on such vessels and the skill of local craftsmen in maintaining them. The boat's design is perfectly suited for the conditions on the Sea of Galilee. Its shallow draft would have allowed it to operate in the lake's varying water levels, while its sturdy construction could handle the sudden storms that frequently sweep across the water. Anyone familiar with gospel accounts of Jesus and his disciples being caught in storms on the lake can appreciate the practical wisdom embedded in this design. Archaeological evidence found with the boat provides additional context. Pottery sherds and other artifacts discovered nearby confirm the 1st century dating and provide insights into the daily life of Galilean fishermen. The evidence suggests this wasn't just a fishing boat, but a multi-purpose vessel used for both fishing and transportation. The discovery is significant because it provides physical evidence for the maritime culture described in the Gospels. Many of Jesus' most important teachings took place on or near the Sea of Galilee, and several of his disciples were fishermen who would have been intimately familiar with boats like this one. The Gospels describe Jesus teaching from boats, using them as floating platforms to address crowds gathered on the shore. The Galilee boat's size and design make it perfectly suited for such use. Its flat bottom and stable construction would have provided an ideal speaking platform. The boat also illuminates the economic context of Jesus' ministry. Fishing was a significant industry in first-century Galilee, with fish being exported throughout the Roman Empire after being salted and preserved. The disciples who left their nets to follow Jesus weren't abandoning subsistence fishing, but giving up potentially profitable businesses. Analysis of the boat's construction reveals interesting details about first-century shipbuilding practices. The builders used whatever wood was available, incorporating at least 12 different types of timber. This suggests either resource scarcity or simply practical frugality, using whatever materials were at hand to build and maintain the vessel. The boat's preservation is itself remarkable. The particular conditions in the Sea of Galilee's mud created an environment that prevented decay while gradually replacing the wood's cellular structure with minerals. This natural preservation process maintained the boat's shape and structural details with extraordinary fidelity. During the excavation, archaeologists made another interesting discovery. The boat had been deliberately stripped of all reusable parts before being abandoned. The mast, sail, rigging, and any portable equipment had all been removed. This suggests the boat was abandoned not because of sudden disaster, but because it was no longer economically viable to repair. The timing of the boat's abandonment is also significant. Historical evidence suggests it was scuttled around 70 CE, during or shortly after the First Jewish-Roman War. This was a period of tremendous upheaval in Galilee, with the Roman legions systematically destroying Jewish settlements around the Sea of Galilee. The boat's discovery location near Magdala is also noteworthy. Magdala was likely the home of Mary Magdalene and was an important fishing center in first-century Galilee. Recent excavations at Magdala have uncovered a first-century synagogue with a stone carved with images of boats, providing additional evidence for the area's maritime culture. Today, the Galilee boat is housed in a specially constructed pavilion at the Yigal Allon Museum on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The preservation process required 14 years of careful treatment, gradually replacing the water in the wood with synthetic wax to prevent deterioration. When visitors see the boat today, they're looking at the actual type of vessel that Jesus and his disciples used as they traveled around the Sea of Galilee. While we can't know if Jesus ever set foot in this particular boat, we can be certain that he was familiar with boats just like it. Discovery 7, the James Ossuary, the brother of Jesus. In 2002, the archaeological world was electrified by the announcement of a discovery that could potentially be the first physical evidence directly connected to Jesus of Nazareth. A limestone ossuary had surfaced in the antiquities market, bearing an Aramaic inscription that read, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." If authentic, this would be extraordinary. James, the brother of Jesus, is mentioned in the New Testament and early Christian sources as a significant figure in the early Christian church, eventually becoming its leader in Jerusalem. An ossuary bearing his name would be the closest physical link to Jesus ever discovered. The ossuary itself is typical of first-century Jewish burial practices. Measuring about 20 inches long, 10 inches wide, and 12 inches high, it's made of limestone with a simple, undecorated design, exactly what you'd expect for a working-class family's burial container. The inscription is carved in Aramaic script, consistent with first-century Jerusalem. But from the moment of its announcement, the James ossuary became embroiled in controversy. The ossuary had emerged from the shadowy world of the antiquities market rather than a controlled archaeological excavation, making its provenance impossible to verify. This immediately raised red flags among archaeologists who recognized the dangers of unproven-anced artifacts. The owner, Israeli collector Oded Golan, claimed he had purchased the ossuary decades earlier from an Arab dealer in Jerusalem. However, He could provide no documentation of the purchase, no photos showing the ossuary in his collection before 2002, and no witnesses who could confirm his ownership of the piece prior to its sudden fame. Epigraphers who examined the inscription found themselves divided. Some, like André Lemaire of the Sorbonne, who first published the inscription, argued that the script, language, and carving techniques were all consistent with first-century practice. The names James, Joseph, and Jesus were all common in first-century Palestine. But the combination of all three in a familial relationship was unusual enough to be significant. Others raised concerns about subtle aspects of the inscription. The patina, the natural buildup of minerals on ancient stone surfaces, appeared inconsistent across different parts of the inscription. Some letters showed signs of modern tool marks. The phrase "brother of Jesus" seemed to be carved in a slightly different hand than the rest of the inscription. The Israeli Antiquities Authority launched an intensive investigation, subjecting the ossuary to every scientific test available. Geologists analyzed the stone and patina. Paleographers examined the script under microscopes. Materials scientists studied the tool marks and carving techniques. Their conclusion was damning. The ossuary itself was genuine and ancient, but the inscription was a modern forgery. According to their analysis, someone had taken a legitimate first-century ossuary and added the inscription referencing Jesus, likely in the late 20th century. The evidence they cited included microscopic analysis showing that the patina over the inscription was artificial, created by heating and chemical treatment rather than centuries of natural accumulation. The tool marks were consistent with modern steel tools rather than ancient bronze or iron implements. Most tellingly, they found traces of modern chalk and other materials in the inscription that don't occur naturally in ancient contexts. Based on this investigation, Israeli authorities charged Oded Golan with forgery and fraud. The trial, which lasted several years, became a battleground between those who believed the inscription was authentic and those convinced it was fake. However, the trial's outcome was more ambiguous than either side expected. In 2012, Golan was acquitted of the forgery charges, not because the court determined the inscription was authentic, but because the prosecution couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Golan himself had created the forgery. The judge noted that the evidence was insufficient to determine definitively whether the inscription was ancient or modern. This verdict left the James ossuary in archaeological limbo. Some scholars continue to argue for its authenticity, pointing out that the scientific tests used to determine forgery are not foolproof, and that the inscription's linguistic and paleographic features remain consistent with first-century practice. They argue that the statistical probability of finding an ossuary with exactly this combination of names from the right time period is remarkably low, perhaps 1 in several hundred. In first-century Palestine, roughly 20% of men were named Joseph, 2% were named James, and less than 1% were named Jesus. For all three names to appear in the correct familial relationship on a single ossuary would be extremely unusual, unless it referred to the specific family described in the New Testament. Supporters also note that the inscription includes details that a forger might not have known. The use of brother rather than son for Jesus is unusual in ossuary inscriptions, but aligns with what we know about James's relationship to Jesus from early Christian sources. The Aramaic is grammatically correct, but not in the simplified form that a modern forger might use. Critics counter that these very details make the inscription suspicious, too perfect, too exactly what scholars would expect to find. They argue that a skilled forger with access to academic literature could have crafted an inscription that included precisely these authentic-seeming details. The controversy highlights a fundamental problem in biblical archaeology: the enormous financial incentive to create forgeries of biblical artifacts. A genuine first-century inscription mentioning Jesus would be worth millions of dollars, creating powerful motivation for fraud. The James Ossuary case also demonstrates the crucial importance of archaeological context. Even if the inscription were proven authentic, its value as historical evidence is severely compromised by the lack of controlled excavation. We don't know where it was found, what other artifacts were associated with it, or what the burial context might have revealed about the family it belonged to. Today, the James Ossuary remains one of archaeology's most controversial artifacts. It sits in Oded Golan's apartment in Tel Aviv, simultaneously the most famous and most disputed potential link to Jesus in existence. Whether it's an extraordinary confirmation of Jesus's historical existence or an elaborate fraud may never be definitively determined. Discovery 8. The Bethesda Pool, where Jesus healed the paralyzed man for centuries. Skeptics pointed to the Gospel of John's description of the Pool of Bethesda as evidence that the author was unfamiliar with first-century Jerusalem. According to John chapter 5, near the Sheep Gate in Jerusalem was a pool called Bethesda, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades, where sick people gathered, hoping to be healed. Jesus encountered a paralyzed man there and healed him. Critics argued that no such pool existed, and that the description was either fictional or based on confused memories of other locations. The 5 porticos seemed particularly suspicious. What pool would need 5 covered walkways? The detail appeared to be the kind of embellishment that suggested legendary rather than historical material. Then, archaeology began to speak. Excavations near the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem, conducted primarily by French archaeologists from the École Biblique, gradually revealed the remains of an ancient pool complex that matched John's description with stunning accuracy. The discoveries unfolded over several decades, with each new season of excavation adding pieces to an increasingly compelling puzzle. The archaeologists found not one pool, but 2 large rectangular pools, situated side by side, separated by a central partition. This central partition, combined with colonnades around the perimeter of each pool, created exactly 5 covered areas, 4 around the outside and 1 down the middle between the pools. The pools were massive, each measuring approximately 165 feet by 220 feet and up to 20 feet deep. This wasn't a small neighborhood gathering place, but a major public facility that could accommodate hundreds of people. The scale of the construction indicated significant investment by Jerusalem's authorities. But the most remarkable discovery was what the pools were used for. Archaeological evidence revealed that this was a healing sanctuary, exactly as described in the Gospel of John. The site contained numerous votive offerings, small clay models of body parts left by people seeking healing for specific ailments. Arms, legs, hands, feet, and internal organs were all represented, showing that people came here specifically hoping to be cured of various conditions. The dating of the site aligns perfectly with the Gospel account. Pottery and other artifacts confirm that the pools were in active use during the 1st century CE. Construction appears to have begun in the 3rd century BCE and continued through the Roman period, making it well established by the time of Jesus' ministry. The pools were supplied by an underground spring, which explains their association with healing. In ancient times, natural springs were often considered sacred, with many cultures believing that flowing water possessed healing properties. The intermittent flow of the spring may have given rise to the tradition mentioned in some Gospel manuscripts about an angel troubling the well. Excavations have revealed that the site had a complex history spanning several centuries. Originally, it appears to have been a reservoir for collecting rainwater. During the Hellenistic period, it was expanded and developed as a healing sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. This explains why sick people gathered there even before Jesus' time. The Roman period saw further expansion of the facility. The Romans added additional pools and built elaborate colonnades with beautiful columns, some of which have been found in the excavations. This was clearly a prestigious and well-maintained public facility. The archaeological evidence also explains why the Gospel of John is so precise in its description. The author wasn't inventing details, but describing a well-known Jerusalem landmark that would have been familiar to anyone living in or visiting the city during the 1st century. The location near the Sheep Gate is also archaeologically confirmed. The pools are situated in the northern part of the Old City, close to what would have been the Sheep Gate mentioned in Nehemiah's account of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. This gate provided access to the temple area for bringing sacrificial animals, making the nearby healing pools easily accessible to pilgrims and residents alike. One of the most intriguing aspects of the site is how it bridges Jewish and pagan healing traditions. While the original pools may have been built for practical water storage, their development as a healing sanctuary reflects the syncretic religious environment of 1st century Jerusalem, where Jewish, Greek, and Roman influences intersected. The Gospel account of Jesus healing the paralyzed man at Bethesda takes on new meaning when understood in this archaeological context. The man had been coming to this healing sanctuary for 38 years, hoping that the sacred waters would cure his condition. Jesus' healing represents not just a physical miracle, but a direct challenge to the existing religious and medical system represented by the pool complex. The detail about the man picking up his mat and walking also makes more sense in light of the archaeological evidence. The 5 porticos would have provided shelter for people camping out at the healing sanctuary, waiting for their opportunity to enter the waters. People would have brought bedding and personal belongings, setting up temporary encampments around the pools. The size and prominence of the Bethesda complex also explains why Jesus' healing there would have attracted so much attention. This wasn't a quiet, private miracle, but a public healing at one of Jerusalem's most famous gathering places for sick people. Later Christian tradition recognized the significance of the site, and a series of churches were built over the ruins of the ancient pools. The current Church of St. Anne, built by Crusaders in the 12th century, stands directly over part of the ancient complex. Today, visitors to Jerusalem can descend into the excavated remains of the Bethesda pools and see the actual stones where Jesus encountered the paralyzed man. The site provides a tangible connection to one of the most detailed healing accounts in the Gospels. The Bethesda discovery demonstrates how archaeological evidence can transform our understanding of gospel narratives. What once seemed like fictional embellishment now appears as accurate historical description, based on intimate familiarity with 1st century Jerusalem's geography and institutions. Discovery 9, the Nazareth inscription, Caesar's edict about tomb robbery. In 1878, a French collector named Wilhelm Frohner acquired a mysterious marble tablet inscribed in Greek, from a dealer who claimed it came from Nazareth. For decades, the inscription sat largely ignored in Froner's collection, and later in the Cabinet de Médailles at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It wasn't until scholars began studying it more carefully in the mid-20th century that they realized its potentially explosive significance. The inscription, which became known as the Nazareth inscription or the Nazareth Decree, contains an edict from a Roman Caesar regarding tomb robbery. At first glance, this might seem like routine Roman legislation. Tomb robbing was a persistent problem throughout the empire, and emperors regularly issued edicts to discourage it. But this edict is different. It's unusually harsh, prescribing the death penalty for tomb robbery, and it specifically mentions the crime of removing bodies from tombs. Most Roman anti-tomb robbing legislation focused on protecting valuable grave goods, not the bodies themselves. This inscription seems primarily concerned with the displacement of corpses. The Greek text of the inscription reads, "It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain undisturbed in perpetuity for those who have made them for the cult of their ancestors or children or members of their house. If, however, any man lay information that another has either demolished them or has in any other way extracted the buried, or has maliciously transferred them to other places in order to wrong them, or has displaced the ceiling or other stones, against such a one I order that a trial be instituted, as in respect of the gods, so in regard to the cult of mortals. For it shall be much more obligatory to honor the buried. Let it be absolutely forbidden for anyone to disturb them. In case of violation, I desire that the offender be sentenced to capital punishment on charge of violation of sepulchre. The severity of this edict is remarkable. Death for tomb robbery was an unusually harsh penalty by Roman standards, especially when the crime involved only the removal of bodies rather than valuable grave goods. This suggests that the emperor was responding to a specific situation that required extraordinary measures. But what makes this inscription truly intriguing is its alleged provenance: Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus. Could this be a Roman response to early Christian claims about Jesus' resurrection? Some scholars have proposed exactly that theory. The argument goes like this: if the Roman authorities heard reports about Jesus' empty tomb and the Christian claim that he had risen from the dead, they might have suspected that the disciples had simply stolen the body to prevent similar incidents in the future. The emperor issued this stern warning specifically targeting the removal of corpses from tombs. This theory aligns with the account in the Gospel of Matthew, which claims that Jewish leaders told the Roman guards at Jesus' tomb to spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body while the guards were sleeping. If this explanation reached Roman administrative levels, it might have prompted exactly the kind of harsh edict found in the Nazareth inscription. The dating of the inscription supports this possibility. Paleographic analysis suggests it was carved in the first half of the 1st century CE, possibly during the reign of Claudius, 41 to 54 CE. This would place it within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, exactly when reports about the empty tomb would have been circulating and potentially reaching Roman officials. The specific mention of Nazareth as the provenance is also intriguing. Nazareth was an insignificant village in 1st century Palestine, not the kind of place where you typically expect to find an imperial edict. If the inscription was indeed placed there, it suggests that the emperor had specific reasons for posting this warning in Jesus' hometown. However, the theory faces significant challenges. The inscription's provenance is uncertain. It emerged from the 19th century antiquities market, and we have only the dealer's word that it came from Nazareth. Given the financial incentive to create connections between artifacts and biblical sites, this claim must be viewed with skepticism. Additionally, some scholars argue that the inscription's language and concerns are more consistent with standard Roman tomb protection legislation than with a specific response to Christian resurrection claims. The edict mentions traditional Roman concerns about ancestor worship and proper burial practices, suggesting it may have been prompted by conventional tomb robbing rather than theological disputes. Recent scholarship has proposed alternative interpretations. Some suggest the edict might have been issued in response to Jewish burial practices that seemed unusual to Roman authorities, or to conflicts between different religious communities over burial rites and tomb access. Another possibility is that the inscription has nothing to do with Christianity at all, but represents the kind of routine administrative correspondence that Roman governors regularly sent to provincial cities to address local problems. The harsh penalties might reflect not theological concerns, but simply the seriousness with which Romans viewed violations of burial sanctity. The inscription also raises broader questions about how quickly news of Christian claims might have reached Roman administrative levels. If the edict is indeed a response to resurrection reports, it suggests that Christian proclamation had a more immediate impact on Roman governance than previously assumed. Archaeological evidence from Nazareth provides some context for evaluating these theories. Recent excavations in Nazareth have confirmed that it was indeed a small Jewish village in the 1st century, with a population of perhaps only a few hundred people. The discovery of 1st century tombs and burial practices in the area provides insight into local customs that might have attracted Roman administrative attention. Whether or not the Nazareth inscription represents a Roman response to Christian resurrection claims, it provides valuable evidence about Roman attitudes toward tomb security and burial practices in 1st century Palestine. It demonstrates the seriousness with which Roman authorities viewed violations of burial sanctity and their willingness to use capital punishment to protect tomb integrity. The inscription remains on display at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where scholars continue to debate its significance. While its connection to Christian origins remains speculative, it serves as a fascinating window into the kinds of administrative challenges that Roman governors faced in managing the diverse religious communities of 1st century Palestine. Discovery 10. The crucifixion victim from Givat HaMivtar, physical evidence of Roman crucifixion. In 1968, construction work at Givat HaMivtar in northeastern Jerusalem uncovered a series of Jewish tomb caves dating to the 1st century CE. As archaeologists examined the contents of these tombs, they made a discovery that would provide the first and only direct physical evidence of Roman crucifixion ever found by archaeologists. Inside one ossuary, marked with the name Yehohanan, archaeologists found the bones of a young man who had clearly been crucified. But what made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the evidence of crucifixion itself, but what it revealed about the actual mechanics of this brutal form of execution. The most dramatic evidence was immediately apparent. A 7-inch iron nail was still pierced through the right heel bone, with fragments of olive wood still attached. The nail had been driven through both feet simultaneously, pinning them to either side of the wooden upright. But when the body was removed from the cross, the nail couldn't be extracted because its tip had struck a knot in the wood and bent over, permanently securing it in place. This gruesome detail provided archaeologists with unprecedented insight into Roman crucifixion techniques. For centuries, scholars had debated exactly how crucifixion was carried out, relying primarily on literary descriptions from ancient sources. The Givat HaMivtar discovery provided physical evidence of the actual methods used. The bones revealed additional details about the crucifixion process. Both leg bones showed evidence of fractures, consistent with the Roman practice of crurifragium, breaking the legs of crucified victims to hasten death by preventing them from pushing up to breathe. This practice is mentioned in the Gospel of John, which notes that the soldiers broke the legs of the two criminals crucified alongside Jesus, but didn't break Jesus's legs because he was already dead. Examination of the arm bones provided evidence about how the arms were attached to the cross. Rather than nails through the palms as often depicted in art, the evidence suggested that nails were driven through the wrists or forearms. The bones showed wear patterns consistent with the victim's weight being supported by nails through the wrist area, which anatomically makes much more sense than palm crucifixion. The discovery also revealed details about the cross's construction. Wood fragments still attached to the nail were identified as olive wood for the upright and pistachia wood for a footrest or suppedaneum. This mixed construction suggests that crosses were built from whatever materials were readily available, rather than following standardized specifications. Dating of the tomb and its contents confirmed that Yehohanan was crucified sometime between 7 to 70 CE, making him a contemporary of Jesus and the other crucifixion victims mentioned in the New Testament. This places his execution within the same historical and political context as Jesus's crucifixion. The victim's age and physical condition also provide insights into Roman crucifixion practices. Yehohanan was between 24 to 28 years old and showed no signs of previous injuries or diseases that might have made him particularly vulnerable to crucifixion. This suggests he was a healthy young man who had somehow run afoul of Roman authority. The fact that Yehohanan's family was able to retrieve his body and give it proper Jewish burial is also significant. Roman practice typically left crucified criminals hanging until their bodies were devoured by scavengers or fell apart from decomposition. The ability to retrieve the body suggests either that Yehohanan's family had sufficient influence to petition Roman authorities, or that his crime was not considered serious enough to warrant the additional humiliation of preventing proper burial. This detail provides important context for understanding the Gospel accounts of Jesus' burial. The Gospels describe Joseph of Arimathea requesting Jesus' body from Pilate and being granted permission to remove it for burial. The Givat HaMivtar discovery demonstrates that such requests were sometimes granted, making the Gospel account more historically plausible. The preservation of Yehohanan's remains also tells us something about Jewish burial practices in 1st century Palestine. The practice of secondary burial in ossuaries, collecting the bones after the flesh had decomposed and placing them in limestone boxes, was common among Jews of this period. The family's willingness to go through this process despite the shame associated with crucifixion suggests strong family bonds and religious commitment. Analysis of other bones found in the same ossuary revealed that Yehohanan was buried together with a child, possibly his son. This family burial arrangement was typical of Jewish practice, but adds poignancy to the discovery. We're not just looking at the remains of a crucifixion victim, but at a family tragedy preserved in stone and bone. The discovery prompted renewed scientific interest in crucifixion as a form of execution. Medical researchers used the evidence from Yehohanan's bones to better understand the physiological effects of crucifixion, confirming that death typically resulted from asphyxiation as the victim gradually lost the strength to push up and breathe. The Givat HaMivtar crucifixion victim also provides important evidence about the prevalence of crucifixion in first-century Palestine. The fact that archaeologists have found only one crucified skeleton from this period, despite excavating hundreds of contemporary tombs, suggests that crucifixion was relatively uncommon or that most victims were not given proper burial. This rarity makes the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion more significant. If crucifixion was typically reserved for serious crimes against Roman authority, Jesus' execution by this method suggests that the Romans viewed him as a genuine political threat, not merely a religious teacher. The iron nail from Yehohanan's heel bone is now displayed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, providing visitors with a stark and visceral connection to the reality of Roman justice in first-century Palestine. When you look at that bent nail, you're seeing the actual instrument of execution used against a contemporary of Jesus. The discovery transforms our understanding of crucifixion from an abstract concept discussed in ancient texts to a concrete historical reality with specific techniques, materials, and human consequences. It reminds us that behind the theological significance of Jesus' crucifixion lies the brutal reality of a form of execution that was designed to maximize suffering and public humiliation. Discovery 11. The Tel Dan House of David Stela. Additional confirmation. While we've already discussed the remarkable Tel Dan inscription and its mention of the House of David, there are additional layers to this discovery that deserve deeper exploration. The stela fragments found at Tel Dan represent much more than just a mention of David's dynasty. They provide a window into the complex political relationships of the 9th century BCE and offer additional confirmation of biblical historical accuracy. The discovery story itself is worth revisiting in greater detail. When Avraham Biron's team found the first fragment in 1993, they knew they had something significant, but they couldn't have imagined how much more was waiting to be discovered. The fragment had been incorporated into a later wall as just another building stone, its historical significance completely forgotten by the ancient builders who reused it. A year later, in 1994, 2 additional fragments were discovered nearby, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct more of the original inscription. These additional pieces provided crucial context that transformed our understanding of the entire monument. The reconstructed text reveals a detailed account of military campaigns against both Israel and Judah. The inscription boasts of victories over the King of Israel and the King of the House of David, providing the first extra-biblical reference to David's dynasty. But the text goes further, describing specific battles and territorial conquests that align remarkably well with biblical accounts of the same period. According to the inscription, the Aramean king who erected the stela claimed credit for killing both Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah. This directly parallels the biblical account in 2 Kings 8 and 9, which describes these 2 kings dying in conflicts with Hazael of Damascus, the Aramean ruler who most scholars believe commissioned this victory monument. The biblical account provides additional details about these events. According to 2 Kings, Joram and Ahaziah were allies who fought together against the Arameans. Both were wounded in battle, and both died as a result of their injuries. The Tel Dan inscription's claim to have killed both kings aligns perfectly with this biblical narrative. But the inscription reveals something even more significant about ancient Near Eastern political relationships. The fact that the Aramean king specifically mentions the House of David rather than simply Judah or Jerusalem indicates that David's dynasty was well established and internationally recognized by the 9th century BCE. This detail addresses one of the main arguments of biblical minimalists, who claimed that David was either fictional or a minor tribal leader whose importance was greatly exaggerated by later biblical writers. The Tel Dan inscription demonstrates that David's dynasty was significant enough to be acknowledged by Israel's enemies more than a century after David's death. The inscription also provides insights into ancient warfare and propaganda. Victory stelae like this one were common throughout the ancient Near East, serving both to commemorate military achievements and to intimidate future enemies. The fact that this particular stela was erected at Dan, on the border between Aram and Israel, suggests it was intended as a warning to anyone considering resistance to Aramaean power. The archaeological context of the discovery adds another layer of significance. Tel Dan was identified as the biblical city of Dan based on geographical and textual evidence, but the discovery of the inscription provided additional confirmation. The inscription was found in the gate area of the ancient city, exactly where you'd expect to find a victory monument erected by a conquering army. Excavations at Tel Dan have revealed extensive evidence of destruction and rebuilding during the 9th century BCE, consistent with the military campaigns described in both the inscription and biblical accounts. The archaeological evidence shows that the city was indeed conquered and occupied by Aramaean forces, exactly as the inscription claims. The discovery also sheds light on ancient literacy and record-keeping practices. The inscription is written in Aramaic using a script that was becoming standardized across the ancient Near East during this period. The quality of the carving and the formal language used demonstrate that the Aramaean kingdoms had sophisticated bureaucratic systems capable of producing official documents and monuments. Analysis of the stone itself provides additional historical information. The basalt used for the stela came from the Golan Heights region, confirming that the monument was indeed produced in the Aramaean sphere of influence. The carving techniques and artistic style are consistent with other Aramaean inscriptions from the same period. The inscription's discovery has also prompted renewed archaeological investigation of other sites mentioned in the text. References to specific cities and regions have helped archaeologists identify and excavate locations that play important roles in biblical narratives about the divided monarchy period. One of the most significant aspects of the Tel Dan inscription is how it demonstrates the historical reliability of biblical chronology. The events described in the inscription align not just with the general biblical narrative, but with specific dating and sequence of events recorded in 1st and 2nd Kings. This chronological accuracy is particularly important because it addresses claims that biblical historical books were written much later than the events they describe, and therefore can contain reliable historical information. The Tel Dan inscription suggests that accurate historical traditions about the monarchic period were indeed preserved and transmitted to later biblical writers. The discovery has also contributed to our understanding of ancient Israelite political organization. The inscription's distinction between the King of Israel and the King of the House of David confirms that the northern and southern kingdoms were indeed separate political entities during this period, exactly as described in biblical accounts of the divided monarchy. Recent analysis of the inscription using advanced imaging techniques has revealed additional details that weren't visible when it was first discovered. These technical advances have allowed epigraphers to read previously unclear letters and confirm disputed readings, strengthening the case for the inscription's historical significance. The Tel Dan inscription remains one of the most important archaeological discoveries for biblical studies, not just because it mentions David, but because it demonstrates the historical accuracy of biblical accounts about a crucial period in ancient Israel's history. It serves as a bridge between biblical narrative and archaeological evidence, showing how these two sources of information can complement and confirm each other. Discovery 12. The Ketef Hinnom Silver Scrolls, the oldest biblical text. In 1979, archaeologist Gabriel Barkay was excavating burial caves at Ketef Hinnom, a site overlooking the Hinnom Valley, just outside Jerusalem's Old City walls. His team was working in what appeared to be a family tomb dating to the late Iron Age, when they made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of biblical text transmission. Among the burial goods scattered throughout the cave, Barkay's team found two tiny silver scrolls, tightly rolled and severely corroded. At first glance, they appeared to be simple pieces of silver jewelry or amulets. It would be 3 years before anyone realized they contained the oldest biblical text ever discovered. The scrolls were so fragile and corroded that unrolling them seemed impossible. Traditional archaeological methods would have destroyed them instantly. It wasn't until the 1990s that advances in conservation technology made it possible to carefully unroll and examine the scrolls without destroying them. When conservators finally managed to open the scrolls and study them under microscopic examination, they found Hebrew text inscribed in ancient script. As scholars painstakingly deciphered the tiny letters, they realized they were looking at portions of the priestly blessing from Numbers 6:24 to 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. These scrolls date to approximately 600 BCE, making them 4 centuries older than the previously earliest known biblical manuscripts, among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They push back the date of biblical text transmission into the period of the First Temple, when the biblical books were supposedly first being written. But the scrolls revealed something even more remarkable about ancient biblical text transmission. Despite being separated by 4 centuries, but text on the silver scrolls matches the biblical version found in later manuscripts with extraordinary accuracy. This suggests that biblical texts were being preserved and transmitted with remarkable fidelity much earlier than scholars had previously believed possible. The scrolls also provide insights into ancient Jewish religious practices. They were clearly intended as amulets, worn by individuals for protection and blessing. This demonstrates that biblical texts were not just liturgical documents used in formal religious settings, but personal spiritual resources that individuals carried with them in daily life. The archaeological context of the discovery adds additional significance. The scrolls were found in a burial cave used by a wealthy Jerusalem family during the final decades before the Babylonian destruction of the city in 586 BCE. The grave goods found with the scrolls indicate that the family had sufficient resources to afford silver amulets and elaborate burial practices. This context suggests that biblical texts were circulating among Jerusalem's upper classes during the final years of the Kingdom of Judah. The scrolls provide evidence that the Book of Numbers, or at least portions of it, existed in written form and was considered sufficiently sacred to be inscribed on precious metal amulets. The technical aspects of creating these scrolls are also remarkable. The silver is extremely thin, requiring sophisticated metalworking techniques to produce sheets that could be inscribed and rolled without breaking. The Hebrew text is inscribed in mirror image, indicating that the craftsmen who created the scrolls were skilled in the complex process of reverse engraving. Analysis of the Hebrew script used on the scrolls provides additional dating evidence. The letter forms are consistent with late 7th or early 6th century BCE paleographic standards, confirming the archaeological dating of the tomb. This represents the earliest known example of Hebrew biblical text in its original ancient script. The scrolls also shed light on the relationship between biblical texts and ancient magic practices. While modern Judaism generally discourages magical practices, these scrolls demonstrate that in ancient times, biblical texts were considered to possess protective power when worn as. This practice may be reflected in biblical commands to bind God's words as a sign on your hand and as symbols on your forehead. One of the most intriguing aspects of the discovery is what it suggests about literacy in ancient Judah. The existence of biblical text amulets implies that at least some members of Jerusalem society could read Hebrew script and would recognize biblical quotations. This provides evidence for higher literacy rates among the upper classes than some scholars had assumed. The scrolls have also contributed to debates about when biblical books were written. Critics who argued that books like Numbers were composed during or after the Babylonian exile now must account for the existence of these texts in 6th century BCE Jerusalem. The scrolls provide evidence that at least portions of the Torah existed in written form before the exile. Conservation of the scrolls required developing new techniques that have since been applied to other fragile ancient documents. The methods used to unroll and preserve the Ketef Hinnom scrolls have become standard practices in the conservation of corroded metal artifacts with inscriptions. The discovery also highlights the importance of family burial practices in preserving ancient texts. Unlike public monuments that might be destroyed during wars or urban development, family tombs often remained undisturbed for millennia, preserving delicate artifacts that would have been lost in other contexts. Modern visitors to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem can see the actual silver scrolls displayed alongside enlarged photographs showing the inscribed text. The scrolls are so small that the original inscriptions are barely visible to the naked eye, requiring magnification to read the ancient Hebrew letters. The Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls represent more than just early biblical texts. They provide evidence of how ancient Jews integrated biblical faith into their daily lives and death practices. They show that biblical texts were not merely intellectual or liturgical artifacts, but personal spiritual resources that people literally carried with them and took to their graves. These tiny silver scrolls bridge the gap between biblical composition and biblical transmission, providing physical evidence that sacred texts were being carefully preserved and regarded as spiritually powerful during the final decades of ancient Israel's independence. They remind us that behind the academic debates about biblical dating and composition lie real people who treasured these texts enough to inscribe them in precious metal and carry them as sacred amulets. Discovery 13. The Babylonian Chronicles, confirming the siege of Jerusalem. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British archaeologists working in Mesopotamia uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets from ancient Babylonian archives. Among these tablets were several that would prove to be of enormous significance for biblical studies. The Babylonian Chronicle series, which recorded major events during the Neo-Babylonian Empire period. One tablet in particular, known as the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle, or British Museum Tablet BM 2146, contains an entry that perfectly corroborates one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history: the Babylonian siege and conquest of Jerusalem. The tablet, written in Akkadian cuneiform script, records events from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II with the precision typical of Babylonian administrative documents. The entry for the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign reads, "In the month Kislev, the king of Akkad mustered his army and marched to Hatuland. He encamped against the city of Judah and on the second day of the month Adar, he captured the city and seized its king. This brief administrative note describes exactly the same events recorded in 2 Kings 24, 10-17, and 2 Chronicles 36, 9-10. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, the capture of King Jehoiachin, and the first deportation of Jews to Babylon in 597 BCE. The accuracy of the correlation is remarkable. The Babylonian Chronicle dates these events to Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, which corresponds to 598 to 597 BCE by modern reckoning. The biblical accounts record the same events during the reign of Jehoiachin, who ruled for only 3 months before being captured and deported to Babylon. The Chronicles' mention of capturing the king aligns perfectly with biblical accounts of Jehoiachin's surrender. According to 2 Kings, when Nebuchadnezzar's forces surrounded Jerusalem, Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. The Chronicles' matter-of-fact recording of seizing the king confirms this biblical account. But the Babylonian Chronicle provides more than just confirmation. It adds crucial details that illuminate the historical context. The Chronicle reveals that this campaign was part of a larger Babylonian military strategy to control the western provinces of their empire. Jerusalem wasn't targeted in isolation, but as part of systematic efforts to secure Babylonian control over the Levant. The Chronicle also confirms the biblical chronology with extraordinary precision. The dating formula used in the tablet allows modern historians to calculate the exact date of Jerusalem's capture as March 16, 597 BCE. This level of chronological precision demonstrates the reliability of both biblical and Babylonian record-keeping systems. Additional Babylonian administrative documents discovered in Mesopotamian archives have provided even more details about the fate of the captured king. The so-called Jehoiachin tablets record rations provided to Joachim, king of Judah, and his 5 sons while they lived in Babylonian exile. These tablets confirm that Jehoiachin survived his deportation and lived as a royal prisoner in Babylon, exactly as described in 2 Kings 25, 27-30. The discovery of these tablets resolved a long-standing puzzle in biblical chronology. For centuries, scholars had debated the exact dating of the Babylonian conquests of Jerusalem, with the biblical accounts providing relative dates that were difficult to correlate with absolute chronology. The Babylonian Chronicles provided the precise dates that allowed scholars to create accurate historical timelines. The Chronicles also confirm details about Babylonian military practices described in biblical accounts. The systematic deportation of skilled craftsmen, nobles, and religious leaders mentioned in the Bible is corroborated by Babylonian administrative records that track the movement and resettlement of various population groups throughout the empire. One of the most significant aspects of this discovery is how it demonstrates the historical reliability of biblical chronology during the monarchic period. The biblical books of Kings and Chronicles have been shown to preserve accurate information about the sequence and timing of events, even though they were compiled centuries after the events they describe. The Babylonian Chronicles also provide context for understanding the theological interpretation of these events in biblical literature. While the biblical accounts emphasize the religious significance of Jerusalem's fall as divine judgment for unfaithfulness, the Babylonian records reveal the political and military realities that made these events inevitable. The Chronicles describe Nebuchadnezzar's systematic campaigns throughout the Levant, showing how smaller kingdoms like Judah were caught in the struggle between major powers. This political context helps explain why biblical writers interpreted these events through a theological lens. Military defeat by a superpower required religious explanation. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem itself corroborates the destruction described in both biblical and Babylonian sources. Excavations throughout the city have revealed clear destruction layers dating to the early 6th century BCE, with evidence of massive fires, collapsed buildings, and hasty abandonment. The discovery of the Babylonian chronicles has also contributed to our understanding of ancient historiography. The comparison between biblical and Babylonian accounts of the same events reveals how different cultures recorded and interpreted historical events according to their own values and perspectives. While the Babylonian chronicles focus on military achievements and administrative details, the biblical accounts emphasize moral and religious lessons. Neither account is complete by itself, but together they provide a more comprehensive understanding of these pivotal events in ancient Near Eastern history. The tablets also demonstrate the sophistication of Babylonian record-keeping systems. The chronicles were part of a larger corpus of administrative documents that tracked everything from military campaigns to royal rations. This bureaucratic precision explains how the Babylonian Empire was able to govern such a vast territory effectively. Modern scholars have used the Babylonian chronicles to refine their understanding of chronology throughout the ancient Near East. The precise dating provided by these documents has become a cornerstone for establishing absolute dates for events throughout the region during the first millennium BCE. The discovery of these chronicles represents a triumph of archaeological methodology. The tablets were found in controlled excavations, carefully cataloged, and studied using rigorous scholarly methods. They demonstrate how archaeological evidence can provide independent confirmation of historical events recorded in ancient texts. Today, the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle is housed in the British Museum in London, where it continues to be studied by scholars from around the world. This small clay tablet, barely larger than a modern smartphone, contains information that has revolutionized our understanding of one of the most important periods in biblical history. Discovery 14. The Mesha Stele, the Moabite Stones' Biblical Connections. In 1868, a German missionary named Frederick Klein was traveling through Jordan when he heard local Bedouins talking about a large black stone covered with ancient writing. What Klein discovered would become one of the most important archaeological finds of the 19th century and provide remarkable confirmation of biblical historical accounts. The stone Klein found was a dark basalt monument, 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, covered with ancient text in a script similar to Hebrew. Local tribes recognized its value and began negotiating with European collectors for its sale. Unfortunately, political tensions and competing offers led to the stone being broken into pieces during disputes over ownership. Fortunately, French archaeologist Charles Clermont-Ganneau had made paper impressions of the inscription before the stone was broken. Working from these impressions and the recovered fragments, scholars were able to reconstruct most of the original text and realize its extraordinary significance. The inscription, written in the Moabite language, was erected by King Mesha of Moab in the 9th century BCE. It describes Mesha's military campaigns against Israel and his building projects throughout Moab. But what made this discovery revolutionary was how perfectly it aligned with biblical accounts of the same period. The inscription begins with Mesha describing how his people had been oppressed by Omri, king of Israel, and his successors. This matches exactly the biblical account in 2 Kings chapter 3, which describes how King Mesha of Moab rebelled against Israeli rule during the reign of Omri's descendant, Joram. According to the biblical account, Moab had been paying tribute to Israel. The king of Moab used to pay the king of Israel tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. The Mesha stele confirms this tributary relationship, describing the tribute payments and expressing Moab's resentment at Israeli domination. The inscription provides specific details about the military campaigns that followed Mesha's rebellion. It describes how Mesha conquered Israeli-held territories and captured Israelite towns, killing their inhabitants and dedicating the spoils to the Moabite god Chemosh. These accounts align with biblical descriptions of the brutal warfare that characterized conflicts between Israel and its neighbors. One of the most remarkable correlations involves the town of Nebo, mentioned in both the inscription and biblical accounts. The Mesha stele boasts, "I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all, 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants. For I had devoted them to destruction for Ashtar Chemosh." This description of devoting enemies to destruction uses the same Hebrew concept, hiram, found throughout biblical accounts of ancient warfare. The practice involved complete destruction of enemy populations as a religious offering to one's god. The fact that both Israelite and Moabite sources describe the same practice provides insight into ancient Near Eastern military and religious customs. The stela also mentions specific geographical locations that appear in biblical accounts. Towns like Dibon, Aroer, and Medeba are referenced in both the inscription and biblical geographical lists, confirming the accuracy of biblical knowledge about Moabite territory. Archaeological excavations at sites mentioned on the stela have provided additional confirmation of its historical accuracy. Excavations at Dibon, Mesha's capital, have uncovered evidence of major building projects during the 9th century BCE, exactly as described in the inscription. The stela provides important evidence about ancient literacy and propaganda. Like other royal inscriptions from the ancient Near East, it serves both as a historical record and as political propaganda designed to legitimize Mesha's rule and glorify his achievements. The inscription also sheds light on ancient religious practices. Mesha credits his military successes to his god Chemosh, paralleling how biblical accounts credit Israelite victories to Yahweh. The stele demonstrates how ancient peoples understood warfare in religious terms, with national gods competing through their earthly representatives. One of the most intriguing aspects of the inscription is what it reveals about the political situation in 9th century Palestine. The stele describes complex relationships between various kingdoms, with territories changing hands multiple times as different rulers gained or lost power. The inscription mentions that Omri occupied the land of Medeba and that Israel dwelt there in his time and half the time of his son, 40 years. This reference to 40 years uses the same conventional chronological marker found throughout biblical literature, suggesting shared cultural conventions for measuring historical periods. Point. The Mesha stele also provides evidence for the historical existence of Omri, one of the most significant kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. While Omri receives only brief mention in biblical accounts, the stele confirms that he was indeed a powerful ruler who dominated the region during his lifetime. Assyrian records from the same period refer to Israel as the House of Omri, demonstrating that Omri's dynasty was internationally recognized. The Mesha stele provides additional confirmation of Omri's importance and the accuracy of biblical accounts about his reign. The discovery of the stele also illustrates the challenges of 19th century archaeology. The destruction of the original stone demonstrates how political tensions and commercial interests could interfere with scholarly investigation. Fortunately, Clermont-Ganneau's foresight in making impressions preserved most of the text for future study. Modern analysis using advanced imaging techniques has revealed additional details that weren't visible to 19th century scholars. New readings have clarified disputed passages and provided additional insights into the historical context of Mesha's rebellion. The stele has also contributed to our understanding of ancient Northwest Semitic languages. The Moabite language used in the inscription is closely related to Hebrew, providing linguists with valuable comparative material for understanding how these languages developed and diverged. Today, the reconstructed Mesha stele is displayed at the Louvre Museum in Paris, where it continues to attract scholars and visitors interested in biblical archaeology. The surviving fragments provide a tangible link to the conflicts between Israel and Moab described in biblical historical books. The Mesha stele demonstrates how archaeological discoveries can provide independent confirmation of biblical historical accounts, while also offering alternative perspectives on the same events. While the Bible focuses on Israel's experience of these conflicts, the stele provides Moab's version of the same story, creating a more complete historical picture. Discovery 15. The Cyrus Cylinder, the decree that sent Jews home. Our final discovery takes us to Babylon in 1879, where British archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam was excavating the ruins of the ancient city. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets and artifacts his team uncovered was a small clay cylinder that would prove to be one of the most significant documents in ancient history and a remarkable confirmation of biblical accounts about the return from exile. The cylinder, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, contains a proclamation by Cyrus the Great of Persia after his conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE. At first glance, it might seem like typical royal propaganda. Ancient kings regularly issued proclamations celebrating their conquests and describing their benevolent policies toward conquered peoples. But as scholars translated the inscription, they realized they were looking at something extraordinary, a policy document that perfectly explained the historical context for one of the most important events in Jewish history, the return from Babylonian exile. The cylinder describes how Cyrus conquered Babylon and immediately implemented a policy of religious tolerance and cultural restoration. According to the inscription, Cyrus gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. The text describes how the Persian king restored various peoples to their homelands and rebuilt their temples with royal support. This policy description aligns perfectly with biblical accounts of Cyrus's decree allowing Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. According to the books of Ezra and Chronicles, Cyrus issued a proclamation declaring, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them." The Cyrus cylinder provides the historical context for understanding this biblical decree. Rather than being a special favor granted specifically to the Jews, Cyrus's policy toward the Jewish exiles was part of a broader imperial strategy of religious tolerance and cultural restoration implemented throughout the Persian Empire. The cylinder reveals Cyrus's political wisdom in adopting this policy. Rather than trying to impose Persian culture on conquered peoples, Cyrus gained their loyalty by allowing them to maintain their own religious traditions and cultural practices. This policy of tolerance helped create stability throughout the vast Persian Empire. The archaeological context of the cylinder's discovery adds to its significance. It was found in Babylon itself, at the site of the ancient city where thousands of Jews had lived in exile for over 50 years. The cylinder was discovered in the ruins of Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, where it had apparently been deposited as a foundation document. Dating of the cylinder confirms that it was created in 539 BCE, immediately after Cyrus's conquest of Babylon. This timing aligns perfectly with biblical chronology, which places the first return of Jewish exiles in the first year of Cyrus's reign over Babylon. The cylinder also provides insight into ancient Near Eastern concepts of divine legitimacy. Cyrus claims that Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, chose him to rule because the previous Babylonian king had neglected proper religious observances. This religious justification for conquest was typical of ancient imperial propaganda. The biblical account of Cyrus's decree reflects similar theological interpretation. The book of Isaiah, writing before Cyrus's rise to power, describes him as God's anointed one, Messiah, who would restore Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The Cyrus cylinder provides the historical framework for understanding how this prophecy was fulfilled. The cylinder has also contributed to our understanding of Persian imperial administration. It demonstrates how the Persians used local religious traditions to legitimize their rule and maintain stability in conquered territories. This policy of cultural tolerance was revolutionary for its time and contributed to the Persian Empire's longevity. Archaeological evidence from Judah confirms the historical reality of the return from exile described in biblical sources. Excavations at Jerusalem and other sites show evidence of renewed settlement and construction activity beginning in the late 6th century BCE, exactly when the biblical sources claim the exiles began returning. The discovery of the Cyrus cylinder has also shed light on the complex relationship between imperial policy and religious freedom in the ancient world. While Cyrus's motives were primarily political, his policies created conditions that allowed various religious communities to flourish and maintain their distinctive traditions. The cylinder provides important evidence for the historical reliability of the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which describe the return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Critics had long questioned whether these books contained accurate historical information, but the Cyrus cylinder confirms that their accounts align with contemporary Persian imperial policy. Modern analysis of the cylinder using advanced imaging techniques has revealed additional details about its composition and creation. The quality of the cuneiform script and the cylinder's careful construction indicate that it was an official royal document produced by skilled palace scribes. The cylinder has become a powerful symbol of religious tolerance and human rights. In 1971, the Shah of Iran presented a replica to the United Nations, and it has been called the first Charter of Human Rights. While this interpretation may be anachronistic, the cylinder does represent an early example of official policies promoting religious freedom. The discovery of the Cyrus cylinder illustrates how archaeological evidence can illuminate the broader historical context of biblical events. The cylinder doesn't prove the theological significance that Jews and Christians attribute to the return from exile, but it demonstrates that biblical accounts of these events reflect accurate knowledge of Persian imperial policies. Today, the original Cyrus cylinder is housed in the British Museum in London. though it has traveled to museums around the world for special exhibitions. When you see this small clay cylinder, you're looking at the actual document that authorized one of the most important events in Jewish history, the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. The cylinder reminds us that biblical events took place within larger historical contexts involving international politics, imperial policies, and cultural exchanges. It demonstrates how archaeological discoveries can provide the missing pieces that help us understand how ancient events unfolded and why they happened when they did. Conclusion: what these discoveries mean. As we reach the end of our journey through these 15 remarkable archaeological discoveries, we find ourselves facing a transformed landscape of biblical studies. Each artifact we've examined, from the Pilate stone to the Cyrus cylinder, represents more than just an ancient object pulled from the earth. They are voices from the past, speaking across millennia to confirm details that skeptics once dismissed as impossible to verify. What do these discoveries really tell us? They demonstrate that the biblical texts preserve historically accurate information about people, places, and events from the ancient world. From the existence of Pontius Pilate to the policies of Cyrus the Great, from the engineering of Hezekiah's tunnel to the burial practices revealed in the Caiaphas ossuary, archaeology has consistently supported the historical framework within which biblical narratives are set. These findings don't prove that every biblical account is literally accurate, nor do they validate the theological claims of Scripture. What they do demonstrate is that the biblical writers had access to reliable historical information about the periods they describe. The level of detail and accuracy revealed by these archaeological confirmations suggests that biblical texts preserve authentic historical traditions. Perhaps most significantly, these discoveries show us that the ancient world described in biblical texts was far more sophisticated, interconnected, and well-documented than previous generations realized. The Pool of Siloam wasn't a mythical location, but a major public facility. The Galilee boat reveals the maritime culture that formed the backdrop for Jesus' ministry. The Babylonian Chronicles demonstrate the precision with which ancient empires recorded their activities. Each discovery has also revealed something about the process of archaeological investigation itself. The James ossuary controversy highlights the importance of controlled excavation and provenance. The gradual uncovering of the Pool of Bethesda shows how archaeological understanding develops over decades of careful work. The preservation of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls demonstrates how advances in conservation technology can unlock secrets that seemed permanently lost. These finds have changed the conversation between faith and scholarship. While archaeology cannot prove religious beliefs, it has shown that those beliefs developed within authentic historical contexts, involving real people facing real challenges. The world of the Bible was not a realm of pure myth and legend, but a complex historical reality that archaeology continues to illuminate. The discoveries also remind us how much we still don't know. Each artifact that emerges from the earth answers some questions while raising others. The Tel Dan inscription confirms David's existence, but leaves debates about the extent of his kingdom unresolved. The Nazareth inscription provides intriguing possibilities, but uncertain conclusions. Every archaeological season brings new discoveries that add to our understanding, while opening new avenues for investigation. What makes these discoveries particularly compelling is that they come from multiple time periods, geographical locations, and types of evidence. They weren't found by religious institutions seeking to prove predetermined conclusions, but by secular archaeological teams following standard scientific methods. Many surprised even the archaeologists who discovered them. As we consider the cumulative impact of these 15 discoveries, we see a pattern emerging. Time and again, archaeological investigation has confirmed specific details that critics once used to question biblical historical reliability. The effect has been to demonstrate that biblical texts contain far more historically accurate information than many scholars previously believed possible. This doesn't mean that every archaeological discovery supports biblical accounts. Archaeology has also revealed complexities and contradictions that complicate simplistic readings of biblical texts. But it does mean that blanket dismissals of biblical historical value are no longer tenable in light of the archaeological evidence. The story of biblical archaeology is still being written. Every year brings new excavations, new discoveries, and new insights into the ancient world that produced the biblical texts. Technologies like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and advanced dating methods continue to revolutionize what archaeologists can learn from ancient sites. As we look to the future, we can expect more discoveries that will continue to illuminate the historical context of biblical narratives. Sites throughout the Middle East remain unexplored, and known sites continue to yield new information as excavation techniques improve. But perhaps the most important lesson from these discoveries is that the relationship between faith and historical investigation doesn't have to be adversarial. Archaeological evidence can enhance our understanding of biblical texts without necessarily validating or invalidating their spiritual messages. The historical accuracy of biblical settings and characters can coexist with ongoing debates about the meaning and significance of the events described. These 15 archaeological discoveries have shown us that the ancient world was a real place, inhabited by real people, facing real challenges. The stones speak, and when they do, they often confirm that the ancient authors who wrote our biblical texts knew more about their historical contexts than critics once believed possible. The conversation between archaeology and biblical studies continues, with each new discovery adding another piece to our understanding of the ancient world. As we've seen through these remarkable finds, whether you approach these discoveries as a person of faith seeking historical confirmation, or as a scholar interested in ancient history, they offer the same gift: a deeper understanding of the real world that produced some of humanity's most influential texts. The earth continues to speak, and its voice continues to surprise us. What will the next archaeological season reveal? What ancient secrets still lie buried beneath the tells and cities of the Middle East? As long as archaeologists continue to dig and scholars continue to study, the conversation between faith and history will continue to evolve, shaped by voices from the past that still have stories to tell. The 15 discoveries we've explored today remind us that truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes literally, even after millennia of being buried. In an age of rapid change and constant debate, these ancient stones provide a sense of continuity and connection to the past that few other discoveries can match. As you consider what you've learned today, remember that you've been witness to some of the most remarkable detective stories ever told. Stories where the evidence was buried for thousands of years before finally emerging to shed new light on ancient mysteries. These discoveries invite us to see the biblical world not as a realm of pure faith or pure skepticism, but as a complex historical reality that archaeology continues to illuminate, one artifact at a time. And perhaps that's the most appropriate place to end our journey. Not with final answers, but with a renewed appreciation for the ongoing conversation between past and present, between faith and investigation, between the stories we tell and the evidence we uncover. The stones have spoken, and their testimony continues to enrich our understanding of one of history's most influential collections of ancient texts. Thank you for joining us on this archaeological journey through 15 remarkable discoveries that have transformed our understanding of biblical history. Each artifact we've explored represents countless hours of careful excavation, analysis, and scholarly debate, a testament to human curiosity about our past and our ongoing quest to understand the world that produced these ancient texts. If you found this exploration fascinating, there's so much more to discover about biblical archaeology and ancient history. The conversation between faith and investigation continues with every archaeological season, and new discoveries await that will undoubtedly surprise and enlighten us. What aspect of these discoveries intrigued you most? Which artifact would you most like to see in person? The journey into our ancient past is far from over, and these remarkable finds remind us that the most compelling stories are often those that have waited thousands of years to be told.